Here we are, ladies and gentlemen. We are live. Super excited to have you guys here today. We'll wait a couple minutes to kind of let everybody trickle in. Excited to have all of you who are here live viewing. It's going to be an awesome treat. We've got my man, my dude, my boy, Jimmy Murphy here today. We'll get into more introductions about him and why he's here and why you guys are so lucky to be able to have him as a resource to help you all today. So we'll give folks another couple minutes to get in, and then we'll kind of, do some introductions. We'll let Jimmy give a formal introduction of himself. But excited to have you guys here talking about this very pertinent and important aspect of your future financial picture, student loans, right? Whether you're a pre-PT, a student physical therapist, or a doctor of physical therapy, regardless of where you're at in that spectrum, this period of time, learning about this information can make a tremendous difference in your financial picture, your quality of life, all kinds of things. And Jimmy's going to walk us through that. You'll hear more about my experience personally with working with Jimmy, but he's made such a huge difference for me and my family. And we'll talk about that more in detail. But we've been kind of talking about doing a webinar like this for years, and it's been something that we put on the back burner. But we're excited to be able to give you guys all the opportunity to learn this information and get to know a lot of the things that Jimmy shared with me. As you guys are trickling in, if you wouldn't mind, go ahead and dropping in the chat where you're viewing from, so we can get a picture of where you guys are at and what your weather's like. And I'm coming from Arizona. Jimmy, where are you currently residing?
I'm out in Utah. Recently, we've actually gotten more snow in this year than we have in like the last 5 years combined. We've been getting dumped on. So if you like skiing or snowboarding, Utah is always a good place to go. But this year especially, we've been getting pounded with the snow. So the slopes are really nice this year.
Do you snowboard, right, Jimmy?
Yes. My brother was a pro snowboarder for 10
serious?
years. Yeah, he was. Did you not know that?
I don't remember that. Sheesh.
Yeah, brother was he was a professional snowboarder. He's in video games, like on the Xbox. He's on the covers, some of the characters you could play. Like he was a big name in the snowboarding world in the early 2000s. Didn't ever do like Olympic style. He did more like filming, movies, games. But anyway, so our whole family snowboards.
Wow. Holy
I'm surprised we've been friends 10 years and that's never I haven't brought that up.
You're like kind of a famous snowboarding athlete. Well, related.
Related to him.
Related.
Cool note. This most recent Olympic. So my brother invented a snowboarding move, and they call it the Murphy roll. Really? And somebody performed that in the last Olympics, and the announcer called it out. And the announcer happened to be friends with Jason and knew him. So he called out that role and brought up my brother on the Olympics. So kind of a cool little thing recently.
Gosh, Jimmy, you're so much cooler now.
I know. I'm surprised. I used to tell everybody that because I became famous by association.
You were already so famous in my eyes. You didn't even have to pull that one. You were ready to go.
Right.
Okay. All right. Well,
thanks for chatting in, Ben. Welcome from Orem, Utah. We're not too far away. I'm in Bountiful, so I'm just an hour away from you.
There you go. Kristen's coming from Flagstaff, which I guess they're getting a bunch of snow up there too, which makes sense. Closer to Utah, probably everywhere is getting pounded. Kristen, right. Excited to have you on. Ben, excited to have you on as well. Let's go ahead and get rolling then. So, without further ado, Jimmy, let us commence.
Perfect. Awesome. Thank you for that. And again, just want to say welcome everyone for joining in. I'm super excited to be here. Super excited to talk to you about all things related to student loans. This is something a lot of people have questions on. Really an interesting topic from a financial planning perspective because we've been in a really unique scenario that's never happened before where not only payments but interest rates everything's been paused for 3 years on federal loans. So kind of the default advice for most people for the last 3 years, for all the people that I've been working with, is like, Don't worry about student loans right now while it's zero interest, zero payments. Focus on other things. That may be coming due here, that may be changing soon, but there's a lot to discuss, a lot to unpack. We will be having a Q&A at the end. So if you have questions along the way, drop it in chat. And then afterwards, that way we'll kind of have a running list of questions to talk through, and we'll be able to start addressing them at the end. So I'm going to start off with a little bit of an introduction to myself. My name is, as Sean mentioned, Jimmy Murphy. I'm a certified financial planner. For those of you who don't know what that is, that's basically the gold standard in the financial planning industry. It's basically the highest designation you can get, requires years of experience, and extremely rigorous test. Also, it means I am a fiduciary, which means that I don't get paid, compensated in any way to sell products. So I don't sell products, don't recommend products, get any kind of compensation. Been in planning over 10 years, worked with thousands of people on their finances, and worked with an extremely wide range of people, from massively in debt to major high income earners and everybody in between. So no matter what your financial situation is, likely I've worked with somebody, in a similar spot. I've worked with a lot of different financial firms, Vanguard being the biggest one that most people know, LearnVest, North Star. Started my own company, Money Warrior Academy. Really just passionate about helping people with their personal finances. I wasn't taught a lot about money growing up. I really struggled trying to figure all that out, banging my head against the wall because there was no one really to help me. And so I'm really passionate about turning around and helping kind of the little guys, because there's not a lot of people out there helping the little guys. They're all kind of built to help the wealthy get more wealthy. So I'm really passionate about helping the people start out getting control of their finances, feeling more confident, and feeling less stressed, because I know what it's like to be there. Aside from the professional, this is my family, my wife, Britt, my daughter, Rosie, she's 3, and big family man. Like I live for my family. Everything I do is for them. My hobbies, my pastimes, really all with them. In addition to that, I compose piano music. I love reading books, recently getting into camping, big movies and shows person, Lord of the Rings, Dark Knight, Harry Potter, all that stuff. So that is just a little about me. Now let's go ahead and dive into what you're all here for. And the agenda of what we're going to be lining out is going to be different types of student loans, repayment options, strategies to paying them off, balancing whether to pay off student loans or pursue other goals, looking at debt to income ratio specific for PTs, and then minimizing student loan accumulation, financial order of operations, which is basically how should you approach taking a look at your finances. So student loan types, we're going to keep this fairly high level. 4 main types. You've got federal subsidized, federal unsubsidized, federal grad plus, and private student loans. So federal subsidized is basically for undergrad only. Interest does not accrue during school, and interest doesn't accrue, I think it's during the first 3 years, during the first 3 years of repayment. Since that only applies for undergrad, many of you may have undergrad loans, but the big thing that everyone's looking at is, what are my graduate student loans going to look like? And that's where federal unsubsidized loans kick in. You can borrow this for grad school, maximum of $138K a year. And so depending on what your undergrad and graduate programs look like, you may be covered between these two. If you ended up going more than that, that's where it's going to spill over into the federal grad plus loans. You can borrow a whole lot more money on this. This is generally for the really high cost education, like dental school, law school, some of these ones where people are graduating with 400, 500, 600,000. I worked at a company called Dentist Advisors, where they worked exclusively with dentists. So got to know that profession really well in terms of the types of student loans they're graduating with. But these ones are going to have a little bit higher interest rates, higher fees. So it's generally best to avoid these. If you can, you're going to be maxing out the first two, federal subsidized and unsubsidized. And then the last one is going to be private student loans. And that really depends on your credit score. Interest rates should be higher or lower than federal. Especially as you go further on, your credit score kind of improves. The more you've been building up your credit, you have better chances. That's why people refinance their federal loans kind of eventually to get to private student loan where they can get lower rates. But those ones are the least flexible. They have no kind of income repayment options. So once you do that, you're committed. There's no turning back from private student loans. So federal repayment options, you've got again, we'll kind of keep this high level. Standard is 10 years. If you do nothing, if you do nothing with your student loans, they're going to default to put you on the 10-year track. Your student loans will be paid back in 10 years. The income-driven repayment. Now, income-driven repayment, there's 4 or 5 different options, which we'll go into next. But income-driven repayment, the amount that you're paying in your student loans is based on a percentage of your income. And it can range from 5 to 20%, depending on which plan you're on. And then those plans are over 20 to 25 years. The remaining debt, if you qualify and you didn't pay your full balance off and you're going for loan forgiveness, the remaining balance is forgiven, but results in a large tax bill. That entire amount that's forgiven is considered taxable income. And so if you've got a large student loan balance, you could have a lot forgiven, but then have a big tax bill at the end. Graduated and extended, they're not great options. There's not really a big reason to go into either of those two. Graduated, it's going over 10 years, but no loan forgiveness. Extended repayment is 20 to 25 years, no loan forgiveness. And then the last one is public service loan forgiveness. This is basically working for 10 years at a qualified nonprofit. 10 years, your student loan is forgiven, and there is no tax. You pay no taxes on it. For the PT profession, as I've been chatting with Sean, it seems like that's not a big option for PTs. There could be. Go ahead and add to that.
Yeah, I was just going to add that I'd say in general, like they do exist. I'm not saying they don't, but in general, they're more for primary care providers in rural communities. So like middle of nowhere, Wyoming, there's more opportunities for student loan forgiveness plans that are federal. And you just really have to make sure you know exactly what you're getting into and that you qualify. They're just not as common for physical therapists, but they do exist in small numbers.
Yeah, thanks for that clarification. Yeah. So generally, because that's much more uncommon, I would say generally what people are looking at in repayment options is either standard or an income-driven plan. So income-driven plans, there's 4 core ones, and then there is a new one that's been proposed in legislation. Hasn't fully passed, but they've kind of laid out all the details of it. Hasn't fully finalized, but we'll cover that. So one of the most popular ones is payee. Can be the most advantageous. Does need to qualify. They say you need to qualify, but it basically just means that your payments need to be lower than they would be on the 10-year plan, which if that wasn't the case, I don't know why you would go for that plan anyway. So it's kind of a weird, you need to qualify for it, but it's kind of like I wouldn't be doing this if I didn't qualify for it. So we'll go through some of the numbers of it and then do a breakdown, but this means the payment, the amount that you're going to pay is 10% of your discretionary income, which we'll calculate that in a little bit. And this is a 20-year to loan forgiveness. Payments never exceed the standard repayment plan option. So you're always going to be paying less under this than you ever would under the standard plan. And then a big one, this is a big one if you are married and your spouse works, is your spousal income may not impact payments. And that can be a really, really big deal if you make 80 grand and your spouse makes 80 grand. When factoring in how much you're going to repay under the payee, they're only going to look at 80 grand of income. Versus other plans, they're going to look at the full 160 grand of income. Your payments are going to be much, much larger. So payee is very advantageous if you have a working spouse making good income. The repayee, also 10% discretionary. This is 25 years to forgiveness versus the 20. Payments can potentially grow larger than what they would have been under the standard plan. But with this one, this is kind of has an interesting perk. 50% government subsidy on your interest. So if your payments are really low, if you've got a lot of student loans, your income's not very high, you're going to have a pretty low student payment. And it's likely going to be lower than the amount of interest that is actually accruing on your plan. In that case, the government will subsidize and basically cut that interest in half. They're going to cover that. They're going to wipe that out entirely. So this can be nice if you are, especially if you're single, single and not making major income, which learning about this profession, people aren't graduating making 150, 200 out of the gate. So this one, if you're single and making, that 60, 70, 80, 90K, repay could be nice because of that government subsidy. IBR and ICR will keep high level. They're just not as advantageous. You pay there's going to be higher payment. It's a longer term for both of them. And then this new repay program, it benefits graduate loans, but the biggest benefit is if you have undergrad loans. So some of the big changes is for the payee and the repayee, you notice that it was 10% of the discretionary income. For this new program, it is 5%. So it cuts it in half, cuts the payment in half for undergrad loans only. And then it's 10% for grad loans. 20-year payment. And then the big one is this has 100% from what I've been researching. There's still new information, but from what I'm understanding, it is 100% subsidy on the interest, which means that if you're paying minimum payments, you're not accruing a major tax bomb at the end of 20 years. So your balance is not going to be growing. It's going to be the flat balance. So that's a huge deal, the 100% subsidy and these smaller payments. The second piece is they have increased the deduction of computing what your payments are going to be. So what they use to compute what your payments are going to be is the poverty line. This is what they use to determine how much they're going to exclude from your income to determine that discretionary payment, which we'll go through the calculation here. But basically, it increases it from 150% to 225%. That's just meaning that your payments are going to end up being lower. And then the other thing is with this one, the spouse income also does not impact your payments. So if you're making 80 grand and your spouse makes 80 grand, I hope she makes 180 grand. That'd be awesome. He or she makes 180 grand. Then they're only going to look at your $80,000 when factoring in your payment. So let's go into this. I think this has been something that stresses a lot of people out. Is it feels like a mystery. Like, I don't even know what my payments are going to be. So for the income-driven plans, let's look at discretionary income. Discretionary income is the money that is left over after the necessities, rent, groceries, utilities. Now, the question is, necessities may look different for everybody. Somebody may be fine living in a one-room studio, and other people may, live in a 5-bedroom house. So how do they standardize that? They use the poverty line to determine what they deem as the necessary expenses. So the poverty line in 2023 depends on your family size. So if it's just you and you're single, the poverty line is $14,580. For a family, so if you're married, they got a $19,720, and then if you're married with a kid, $24,860. Then they multiply that poverty line by 150% or 1.5. That's for all these older plans. And then for this new plan, they multiply that by 225% or 2.25. Once they figure that out, they're going to take your last year's income minus that poverty line. That's going to equal your discretionary income. Once you know your discretionary income, you're going to times that by 10% or 5% for the new repayee for undergrads. Divide that by 12, and that comes out to your monthly payment. So I'm going to do an example here. So we've got Joe and Jane, Jane, and Jill. Personal friends of mine. I love them. Don't actually know them. So we're just going to use the example to keep things simple. The $80,000 a year. Now, because they can exclude spouse's income, it's possible that the spouse does have income as well, but that could be totally excluded. So $80,000 a year across the board. The poverty line, you're going to see the poverty line amount increase for each person. The actual amount that it increases for each person is $5,140. Then you take the deduction. So we're just going to use the new repay deduction amount because likely if this all goes through, this is going to be the one that was going to be recommended for most people. So you take that number, the poverty line, times 2.25. And this is the amount that is going to be deducted from your income, from that 80,000. And then once you do that disposable income, so for Joe single, 80,000 minus the 32,800 gives you the disposable income of the 47,195. That's the number that they use to determine what your payment is. So for your undergrad loans, if you're doing 5% of that, your monthly payment's looking at about $196. For your graduate loans, you're looking at 10% of that, and you're looking at $393, regardless of what your loan balance is. If you've got $1 million in student loans, which I've seen people have $1 million in student loans, that's actually crazy. Actually, let me clarify. It was a family of doctors, and combined, they both had like $600,000 of student loans each. But that also means a lot of income. So, but regardless of what you're making, though, that's what the payment amount is. So in this case, 196, graduate, 393. If you compare that to the standard repayment plan, if you've got a high student loan balance, that's going to be drastically lower, which can have a major impact on your cash flow. If you're graduating not at a high income, you don't want 50% of your income going towards your student loan payments and just feeling like you're struggling to survive. So this can be a major relief, having these very low payments on your student loans coming out of the gate.
Jimmy, we did have one question from Kristen about the repayee option. Back a couple slides if you want to go back. One more slide.
One more.
There we go. So on the second option, the repayee.
Yes.
And take your spouse's income into consideration.
Great question. Yes, that one does. So that one's kind of the trade-off, is for the repayee, not as good for married couples with your spouse working, because it does factor in your spouse's income. So if you're making 80, your spouse makes 80, they're looking at 160,000 to determine that payment. That's under the old repayee. That's how it is currently. Under the new one, if this new one passes, the new repayee does not.
Gotcha.
So great question there.
Thanks, Jimmy.
Yeah. Let's see. Comparing monthly payments. Okay. So comparing monthly payments, there's the two things that you want to look at is what is your monthly payment going to be? And what does that translate to in terms of what balance is going to be forgiven? And then on top of that, what taxes are you going to be paying? And there are a lot of factors to determine this, because you are looking at, most people don't know what their income's going to be over the next 20 years. And that's hard because your income is what drives what your payment amount is going to be and how much you're going to have left. I will say the best tool I have found out there is Student Loan Planner. They have a free calculator that is really cool, that you can go ahead and run in all kinds of projections, and you can kind of put estimated income growth, and it's going to spit out what your payments are going to be, the total student loans you're going to pay, the interest, the tax loan forgiveness, and it spits out everything so that you can do a side-by-side comparison. Now, I don't think, this is a snapshot from it. I downloaded this like a couple weeks ago. I don't think it's on there yet, but I'm sure that they will be adding in the new repayee on there. So if you're looking to calculate that, I don't think that one's fully on there yet. But for now, this is a great tool to just kind of project, and you can see kind of full dollar amounts, which one's going to be most cost effective, factoring in all the different pieces. So another thing is student loans. This was actually like, as I've delved into student loans, student loans are so much different than all the other, like a lot of other debts out there. There's so many different facets to it. And I feel like there's things that I continue to learn with it. One of the things is student loans don't accrue as much as you think. So a lot of people are really terrified of high student loans, which is definitely understandable. And they're also terrified of it ballooning really big, so that even if they do go for student loan forgiveness, they're looking at massive tax bombs. But I want to share with you the difference between compound interest and simple interest. So compound interest is what you see in mortgages and credit cards. The way compound interest works is you accrue interest on the interest. And there's a rule, it's called the rule of 72, where you can divide 72 by your interest rate, and that takes you the number of years it takes for it to double. So, example, if you had $100,000 of student loans at 7% interest, and hypothetically, let's say you were making $0 payments. If you divide 100,000 by 7, that's 10 years. That means it would take 10 years for your $100,000 student loan balance to double to $200,000. Then if we do that again, if you now 10 years later, you've got a $200,000 balance at 7%, you divide that by 7, in another 10 years, that balance will double again. So that would be $400,000 in a total of 20 years, which is $300,000 in interest, or 4 times what you originally took out. That is if that's the way student loans worked. Now let's look at simple interest. This is student loans and car loans. With simple interest, you do not accumulate interest on the interest. It just kind of gets set aside. So example, if you had $100,000 of student loans at 7%, making $0 payments, in 1 year, 7% on $100,000 is $7,000 in interest. So you would just multiply 7,000 times 20, which is $140,000 in interest. Add that to your principal, that would be a total of $240,000 loan paid. But compare that. This is the difference between compound and simple. Compound interest, that same scenario resulted in $300,000 in interest versus the simple is $140,000. So less than half. So that is a big difference.
And that's assuming you're not paying anything back at all, right? Like you don't even touch it. So
Correct.
It'll be even less than that.
It will definitely be even less than that. That's just just for the sake of simplicity. It was easier to run an example of not paying anything. But the big thing is like a lot of people think their student loans may just like balloon up exponentially. That's what compound interest does. With simple interest, it's going to be linear. It does not compound, which at the end of the day means you are paying vastly less interest on your student loans than you would say on a mortgage. People compare student loans to a mortgage. Mortgage, you pay double the interest than you will ever pay on your student loans simply because mortgage interest compounds and student loans don't. So, anyways, I think that's a really big deal when you are trying to decide if you feel like you've got a major student loan balance and you're trying to think of going for student loan forgiveness. Just recognize that 7% doesn't result in nearly as much debt accumulation as you might initially have thought. So 5 strategies for paying off student loans. One is public service loan forgiveness in 10 years. In this industry, not super common, but if you have something where you're like, I know I want to do this, that could be a great option. Payback, small payments, student loans off your plate in 10 years. There's no taxes at the end. The payee or the repayee or the new one, going for student loan forgiveness in 20 to 25 years. This could be a great option if you've got significant student loans with not majorly high incomes, or if you have majorly high incomes, even if you have a moderate income and your spouse has a really high income, this should still be a really great option going for forgiveness if you can exclude your spouse's income. So one is, payee, repayee, student loan forgiveness, 20 to 25 years. Third one is the standard loan option to have your debt paid off in 10 years. So this could be an option if you've got higher income and you can afford the payment, that the payment is not going to put you in a bad spot. It's not going to have it's not going to significantly derail your ability to achieve other financial goals. You're not going to have to put your life on hold for 10 years to pay it off. Then there's a combo, and this is a really big strategy, is most people's income is not always linear, but sometimes it kind of goes in chunks. You get your pay raises, but then you get promotions, and your pay raise can kind of go in like a step ladder. And so this is one where you can start off on an income-based plan and make those minimum payments while your cash flow is low. And then as your income goes up, and it goes up significantly, then you consider, you're like, you know what, I'm sick of having the student loans over my shoulder, and my credit is really good, and I can refinance to a much lower rate than my student loans. Then that's kind of a common strategy where people pay income based for a few years, and then refinance to a private loan and get that save a significant amount on interest and then get that paid off. Then there's early loan payment. This is really this one really depends on how big your student loan balance is, how much your income is, and how motivated you are to have this off your shoulders. I would say this is kind of like the Dave Ramseys out there that are like the gazelle intense, beans and rice, living out of a cardboard box. You're like, I want this off my shoulder, and I'm going to do whatever it takes. I think that this could be an option if you're able to pay off your student loans in 3 years. I think that's okay to kind of put goals on hold. If this is important to you, you can have your goals put on hold on 3 years and then have a massive burden lifted. But the main thing is you don't want to put your whole life on hold. You don't want to put your goals on hold. If it's going to take you 5 or 6 or 7 years to pay it off, and you're putting all of your life on hold to do that, I don't think that's necessary. You want to be able to balance living your life, enjoying life as well. You don't want to delay that for such a long time. So considering that balance of paying off student loans early or pursuing other goals. So some things to factor in is paying student loans early. You get a guaranteed rate of return, 6 to 7%, depending on what your rate is. Frees up your cash flow. It will be really nice having that extra cash flow. Reduces your debt to income ratio, so it puts you in a better position for qualifying for a house, or how much house you want to buy. But the biggest one is, I think, just the mental and emotional burden that having that off your shoulders could be. For some people, student loans is like, it's there, I just make the payments, not a big deal. Other people, it keeps them up at night. And they're stressed and they think about it a lot. And so paying off your student loans early could be a good option just from the perspective of I just need to get this weight off my shoulders. And then, as mentioned, that's usually a good option if you can be super aggressive and get it paid off in 2 or 3 years. Balance that with pursuing other goals. If you just kind of go with those lower payment options while you're focused on having a life, buying a car, buying a house, starting a family, those are things that are important to you. And you're like, I want to have this now, and I don't want to wait 6, 7, 8 years to do that, then that's okay. You can go ahead and do those things now, and the student loans will be taken care of eventually. And if you're going that route, you can be investing. And this is one of the things where investing at the same interest rate as your student loans is going to be way better for you, because if you're investing at 7%, remember, your investments compound. So it's going to grow and grow and grow. So it's growing at that exponential rate. So investing at 7% is far greater for building wealth than student loans at 7%, because it doesn't compound. And especially if you get the interest subsidies, where the interest is part of that interest is getting taken care of. So that also is another reason to go for kind of that could be an option for going for that balanced approach, living your life. From a wealth building perspective, you could do far more investing, saving for these goals and investing more money, and then paying the student loans over time. Standard versus fast track. This is just an example here. $120,000 in student loans, 6.8% in 10 years, and assuming an income of $75,000. So Sean was kind of sharing with me kind of the average or the median, the income after graduation is about $75,000 a year. If we're factoring in taxes and deductions, it's about $4,500 a month. So a standard repayment plan would be about $1,380. That would be the payment that you would make there. If you're paying $1,380, it's gonna take you 10 years to pay off, and you're gonna pay off $165,000 or pay about $45,000 in interest. Payment $2,500. Sorry, if you lost track there. If you were to go for fast track and you wanted to throw extra income, $2,500 rather than the $1,380. Your total loan paid is $140,000 with interest paid of $20,000, and your time to have the debt paid off saves you about 5 years, cuts it in half. I think we got a question on the 5 strategies to pay off. You mentioned the terms income, lower, and higher student loans. What's your range when using those terms? I think let me go back to this page.
There you go. Yeah.
I think what it comes down to is how quickly you can pay off the loans, because higher income, the reason why it's hard to quantify this is because higher income can look very different depending on where you live and the standard of living and the size of your family. So someone who's single making $80,000 a year compared, and living in Arkansas versus somebody who's single living in California, married with a kid living in California making $80,000 a year, the amount that they're going to be able to put towards their debt is vastly, vastly different. So when I say high income, it is kind of relative to your family size and your location. So it's hard to put an exact dollar amount. What I would use to determine which one to go for would be less on a dollar amount that you're making and a dollar amount of your student loans, and think about it more from a budgetary perspective. How much can you afford to put towards your student loans? Someone who's making $80,000 a year may only be able to put $500 towards student loans, depending on their family situation and location. Somebody making $80,000 a year may be able to be putting $2,000 or $2,500 if they're living with a family, they're single and living with their parents for a while they focus on student loans. So really depends on that's what I would use to determine it, is how much you can throw at it, and depending on the size of your student loan balance, how quickly you can be paid off. So the fast track, the number that I would use is if you could go for 2 to 3 years hard and get it paid off, regardless of exactly what your income is or your debt amount. If you could get it paid off in 2 to 3 years, that could be the way to go. But if it's going to take a long time, that's where I would focus more on these income-based repayment plans first, and then maybe you can reconsider. I've got another question. I'm wondering if I should apply for the federal plus loan to cover the rest of my school costs, or go for a private loan that has a lower interest rate. It's a good question. So this one, there's a lot of variables here. Federal loan has a lot of flexibility. The biggest thing that federal loan offers is the flexibility of your payments based on your income, and having the ability to pay less and put more towards other goals. It also has a lot of flexibility if you were to ever go through a hardship, if there were to be a job loss and it took you 6 months to find a new job. Federal student loans, you can go for hardship, have student loan payments reduced or paused. Once you go to private, there's no turning back. There is they have no mercy. Let's just say there's the no mercy rule for the private loans. So if you were to do that, I generally only recommend doing that if you're in a really good financial position. You have a really solid 6-month emergency fund. So if there were to be a job loss, you're not going to be struggling to make those payments, because they're going to keep coming due even though you don't have that income. So I would make sure you have a really good financial position before considering refinancing to the lower interest rates. If you're in a good financial position, you've got good income, good amount of savings, then yes, refinancing, if you're wanting to save on interest and get this paid off sooner rather than going for the loan forgiveness, at that point, switching to private makes sense. The biggest thing that I like to just caution is making the switch to private prematurely before you're in a good financial position, because people see the interest rate difference, like, oh, I can save on interest. Want to make sure you're in a really good financial position. For example, pre-COVID, people who switched to private student loans when the whole world was in a worldwide pandemic, those student loan officers were saying, like, I know the whole world has shut down, but we have not. And we are coming for your payments. And so people that were in bad financial positions all of COVID, private loans have been due those last 3 years. Anybody who held on to those federal payments have had a 0% interest loan with 0% payments for the last 3 years, allowing them to focus on building an emergency fund, save to buy a house, do all these things. They've had way more flexibility. So that's the trade-off. Long term, if you're not going for loan forgiveness and you want these paid off, that is a great option. Just be sure that you're in a good financial position to do that. So great question, Leanne. Thank you for that. Okay, we had the okay, so we were just talking about the standard versus the fast track. So let's talk a little bit about debt to income ratio. So just from the average of PTs, again, this is all just learning. This is one thing that's really cool about working with Sean and kind of combining with him, is learning some of the specifics about your industry, rather than just having a general conversation about student loans where you can be talking about kids who got a degree in, marriage and family and they're making $40,000 a year, or somebody who's, a brain surgeon making $500,000 a year. It can be a very wide scope. So it's nice that we can kind of get narrowed in specific on your profession. So average PT school loans, $116,000. Total cost of education on average is about $142,000. So the average person's graduating with $26,000 of undergrad student loans and then their PT student loans. The average PT starting salary, $75,000. So if we were to use that and calculate your debt to income ratio, your gross salary on a $75,000 salary is $6,250 a month. Student loan payment be $1,380 a month. Your debt to income ratio is your student loan payment divided by your monthly gross income. So in this case, it would be 22%. When you're applying for a mortgage or buying a car and they look at your debt to income ratio, that's the number that they look at. Your net, what I think is a more important number, is your net income to debt ratio. And we're assuming this is after taxes. So if we factor in taxes and your net monthly take home pay after taxes, what's hitting the bank is $46.80 a month. And your student loan payment is $13.80 a month. You're putting 29% of your take home pay to the student loans, which that can make it really hard to, depending on what your living situation is, but putting in 30% of your income towards your student loans mandated could be very hard to balance, having paying rent, utilities, bills, living expenses, things like that. Some options to increase your debt to income ratio is either income-based repayment plan. So rather than going for the 10-year standard, going for an income base that's going to significantly lower that payment. You can have a low cost of living. Yes, this doesn't really impact your debt to income. This just stretches and puts you in a better position to handle it. But have a low cost of living with roommates, cheap rent. And then the other one is just increasing your income. I know a lot of people who are like hyper motivated to pay off their student loans and they get a second job. Or if you're Sean, you just start a business and start a business on top of it. Find ways to make extra income to pay it off.
I think go along with that, Jimmy, like that's something that is really unique about physical therapy is you most of the time you're working your standard 40-hour work week versus like lawyers or doctors or dentists. Sometimes they can, depending on where you're the setting. Dentists hardly work at all. I'm just kidding, but but
I can attest to that.
doctors and lawyers. I mean, some of them can be pushing 60, 80, 100-hour weeks, depending on where they work, right? So then you don't really have an opportunity to get a side hustle or to have these other jobs that you could, if you have a small business, you could potentially scale that and it could become substantially larger, and things like that. So there are options to increase your income significantly with PT because of basically what your work schedule looks like in general. So that's something else to consider when looking at, if you have a plan. Like I started out at the beginning of PT school with this idea of making physical therapy application coach, right? And it took years to develop it and to get it to the point where it was really improving and getting bigger and scalable. And now we're starting to really kind of come out of that and see some opportunities, right? So it's not to say that like you're going to start out right out of the gate if you start a business making buku bucks. But if you start early enough and get some ideas on paper and start making some actions toward that, by the time you're making payments on your student loans, you could have several $1,000s extra a month in the bank that you could be either, if you decide to do student loan repayment, if you want that off your back, like my family and I did, or if you want to do other financial goals. So there's lots of options for people. Like you've echoed to me and other people, it's like have a plan and know what you want and then have a plan to get there. And I think that's, for me as a coach, what makes me so sad is people come into PT school and they're like, oh, I'm just going to graduate. And they have no idea, like, which payment plan am I going to do? What can I do to increase my income? And they don't think about that until it's too late. And it's going to take a long time to kind of get that going, things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the two things that happen are the people don't think about it. And because they don't think about it, they get themselves in a pretty sticky financial spot.
For sure.
Few years down the line, and they're like, man, I'm not in a really good spot. Now I got to figure this out. And then there's the people who do think about it, but they're stressed because there's a lot of options and it's not really clear, and they need help mapping out a clear plan with clear steps. And I think financial planning kind of helps both people, but one, it's kind of, you are getting people out of a mess that they've created. Mm-hmm. And I would say that that's often what most happens a lot of the time is people are like, crap. Like, I got myself in a really tight financial spot and now we're getting kicked out of our house. Yeah. That people aren't usually getting kicked out of their house by the time they're reaching out. But I'm just saying, right, a lot of times it's reactionary and people are like, oh, I'm in a really bad situation. Now I really need to figure it out. But then there's also the proactive people. And I think we're getting, the hard thing about the proactive people is they usually aren't making as much money. They don't have any money to invest, or they don't have any money invested. So most of the financial professionals, they're not even looking at them. They don't have access to financial professionals to help them with their questions, because they're like, what, you don't make $200,000 a year, or you don't have $100,000 to invest with me. But they're the people that, the proactive people are the ones that need a lot of help and guidance there, which is why I'm really passionate about being able to help there.
For sure.
So the financial order of operations, the way to think about your student loans, because we don't live in a siloed world where your only financial goal is student loans. You're living your life and trying to balance a lot of different things at once. You're graduating, you've got student loans, you may have credit card debt, you're supposed to have an emergency fund, you need to save for retirement, you want to buy a house, you're going to want to get married at some point. There's a lot of goals coming at us all at once, and a lot of people struggle, like, how do I handle all of this? How do I approach this? And there isn't a one size fits all, because it really depends on what your specific goals are, what you're wanting, what's important to you. But there is an order of operations of how to think about kind of tackling some of these things. So the very first one is learn to budget and manage your cash flow. And some people cringe um, like I used to before, because like I mentioned, I wasn't taught anything about money growing up. Budgeting for me, I was like that sounds like the worst thing in the world. You can make it super, super simple. You do not have to track every penny, every dollar. You just need to understand how much money is coming in a month, what is going out in fixed expenses, and the amount that's left is what you have to balance between your spending on the day to day and how much you have to put towards your goals. And then just come up, once you know that number of how much you're putting towards your goals and how much you're aiming to spend to, there's some systems. That's one of the things that I help people with, is some systems that make it really, really easy to stick to your target spending number. Because without a system there, without a way to kind of track it, that's where people, they can make a budget on paper, but it's very hard to stick to it. But it's a very simple process of how much money's coming in, what are your fixed expenses, know how much you have to put towards goals and how much you have to spend. That's key number one. And that's actually key regardless of your income. That's one of the very first things I talk about with people that are making $500,000 a year is I want to understand, okay, you've got your income sounds really high, but it might not be if your expenses are, I've seen people where they were bringing home 20 grand a month and their expenses were 18 grand a month. And so they weren't in a super great experience, but they're thinking they're doing great because they're like, oh, we're making so much money. I'm like, that's all going right out the door. So it's good to know how much is coming in, how much is going out, how much you have to put towards goals. Number two, pay off toxic debt. This is your high interest rate debt, credit cards, personal loans over 7%. This is compounded debt that's going to be accruing quite a bit. So if you got credit card debt, that's priority number one. Get that knocked out. Priority three is an emergency fund, 3 to 6 months living expenses. Which one to aim for depends on your family situation, your income situation. But 3 to 6 months living expenses. Use a high yield savings account. You're going to be getting 3.5% to 4% in interest. From there, get started saving for retirement. Before you're prioritizing student loans, you need to be, I would recommend an emergency fund, and I would recommend getting started with your 401k. If your employer has a match, definitely be taking full advantage of the match. If they don't have a match, I would at least be doing something 3, 4, 5%, something to be getting that compound growth. As we talked about, that big impact of the compound interest, that has a major, major impact on retirement. So you just want to get started there. And then from there, once you're doing those 4 things, then you get to balance your other financial goals and decide how you want to prioritize them. Student loans, same for car, house, wedding, any other financial goals. So that's kind of how I generally map out most people's financial picture. See, we got a question. What type of loan category would FAFSA fall under? Also, are loans decided on before PT school, during, or after? Great question. So FAFSA is where you go to apply for financial aid. And what they're going to kind of look at your income, financial situation of you and your parents. Based off of that, they're going to determine what your financial aid is. And there's a few things that you can qualify for. One, you could potentially qualify for grants. Grants are different than student loans. Grants is money that the government just gives you and subsidizes you that you can use to go towards school expenses. That's very, very need-based if you qualify for the grants. After that, then they're going to look at how much federal loans you qualify for, and that's where the federal subsidized versus the federal unsubsidized loans are going to factor in. So when you're applying for FAFSA, the 2 major loans they're going to look at qualifying you for is here's how much subsidized loans you qualify for, which is need-based, and here's how much unsubsidized loans you qualify for. Yeah, great question. Also, are loans decided on before PT school, during, or after? Usually it's just on whatever you can qualify for. So you go through FAFSA, they tell you what you can qualify for, and that's your options to go for that. It's after PT school that then people take their loans and look at what their repayment options and how they want to go back about repaying them. Question from Leanne: will we be able to access? Yes, we're going to be sending out the copy of the video, right? Is this
So
going to be
you'll
sent
have the
out?
replay, Leanne, for 72 hours after. So Tuesday morning, the replay link will expire. But yeah, we'll have the slides, but you'll just have the replay of the video, which will have the slides on it for the next 3 days. Yeah.
And then her second part of her question is suggestions for high yield savings accounts. There's a lot out there. Two of my favorites are Ally and Marcus. I've used Ally for 9 years now. I really like them because it's no minimum balance, no fees, no transfer fees, and very, very, very user friendly. You can download the app, set up an account in 5 minutes, and I generally recommend, that's where you just kind of store your emergency fund and anything else. So Ally's kind of my number one pick, but Marcus and Basque are a couple of other options. And okay, so that kind of wraps up everything with the student loans. Kind of a summary of everything. You got two primary repayment options, which is your standard repayment. That's good if you've got the cash flow and you want to save on interest. And then this income driven, which is a good option if you're starting on, when I say lower income, that was a good call out because I say lower income, high student loans all the time. But really, it comes down to it's a good option if, from a cash flow perspective, you're not able to put a lot towards your student loans and you want to focus on other goals. And that could also mean you want to go for loan forgiveness, or it may mean you want to start out low while you can't put as much towards it, and then refinance later on. Paying your student loans off early versus pursuing other goals. Don't put your whole life on hold for 5 years. If you can get laser focused, depending on what your situation is, and pay it off in 2 or 3 years, that could be an option. Otherwise, I think, just be able to balance and don't wait 10 years to start enjoying your life. And then the financial order of operations are, budgeting, understanding your cash flow, toxic debt, credit card debt, emergency fund, start retirement, and then come up with a game plan with balancing your other financial goals. So that wraps up everything that we have. I know we've been asking questions throughout the webinar. This section is just, ask me anything, any other questions that you have. Go ahead and start dropping them in chat. If there aren't very many questions, because we've already kind of addressed them all, that's totally fine. We've got a couple other themes that we're going to be sharing right after the questions.
That was super helpful though, Jimmy. Helped me a lot with some questions I get from people. So thank you. That was great.
Yeah, thanks, Sean. Got a question come in from Raylene. Federal subsidized loans are for graduate, or only for graduate. So subsidized are for undergrad only. So an undergrad means during your 4 years of school, interest is not accruing during it. So that's only for your undergrad. For graduate, the only thing that's available is the unsubsidized. So interest is accruing while you're in school. Great question there, Raymond. We'll leave it for one more minute for another question because I know we've already addressed a lot. and then we'll go in through. Really, I know what we're going to have is these webinars are awesome. I've been doing webinars through my primary job in financial planning, and I've done over 50 of them in the last year, and they're really, really great to give general education and general guidance. But I know that there's a lot of people that are like, this is really awesome information, but what do I do for my specific situation? What do I do? It's so hard translating general information to what to do for ourselves. So we'll talk through some option for customized help there if that's where you're at. Suggestions on resources to use to find. So question from Nick, suggestions on resources to use to find scholarships. That is a super good question. Off the top of my head, I do not know. That is something that I could research and be happy to get back to you. If you drop your email in chat, Nick, I will go ahead and follow up with you and just share with you what I'm able to find. Scholarships has not been something that I have spent any time in my career looking at. So this would be just doing some initial research on what I could find. What about for you, Sean? Do you know of anything off the top of your head?
Yeah, Nick, that's a great question. And I think what I'll do after this webinar is there's a section in our, a lot of our advice that we give to pre-PTs for student loans and just general financial I've got some suggestions on there, and I'm willing to copy and paste those into a follow-up email to all of you guys who registered today, and just to give you some places to go to start looking. But in terms of like specifics, it's usually just locations to go in terms of that, like websites. And I know that we have them. I just don't have them all memorized off the top of my head, but I'll send those out after the webinar is over.
Awesome. Yeah. So if you've got resources, great. We'll just plan on you following up with that. Question from Kyle. What do you say to individuals who say they plan on taking federal loans to the grave, not paying them back? I've heard some individuals bring this up. What are the consequences of this? They will hunt you and find you. No, I'm just messing. No, I mean, that's really one. There's no such thing as taking it to the grave, because that's what the loan forgiveness, unless they die before 20 years. So if they die before 20 years, they took their federal loans to the grave. But yeah, that's really what that whole income-based repayment plan option is. The payee, the repayee. The whole point of that is minimum payments. I apologize. I've got a little bit of a cold and a cough. The whole point of those is to pay as little as possible and then have the rest forgiven in 20 to 25 years. If this new plan goes in, it'll basically be 20 years for everyone. So if you're graduating at, 23, 23 or 24, by 43 or 44, those federal loans, the total balance is forgiven. Now, the consequence is whatever balance that you have left. If you had a balance of $60,000, then that would all be taxable income. So depending on what your income is, what your tax bracket is, you may have a big tax bill of $25,000, which is better than $60,000. But that's the consequences. You have a big tax bill. Sorry, excuse me. You have a big tax bill at the end.
I can answer Lean's question.
Oh, go ahead,
Jimmy. Yeah. So you can
get my water.
Guy. He's been serenading us for like an hour and 15 minutes straight. So Raylene, kind of going back, Jimmy made this point a couple slides ago is that you want to exhaust your federal options first. So apply through FAFSA because you have so much more flexibility. Go through that route first, and then looking into these private companies that are giving out private student loans. That's the order of operations. And you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, Jimmy, but exhaust your federal student loan options to have more flexibility, more repayment options. And then you could look at private student loans, especially if you're a single young student just kind of getting into these larger liabilities as you're entering school. You want to make sure you're getting the most flexible options with federal loans, which give you a lot of different repayment options.
Yeah, I can verify that. FAFSA is going to be your best starting place. Just applying through the federal government because they're going to be the most flexible options rather than trying to figure out private ones right off of the bat. Private loans are when you're at a position where you're looking to refinance. And when you're looking to refinance is when you'll want to shop around and figure out your best options for refinancing. But right out of the gate, applying for student loans, I would just do FAFSA. So great questions there.